Welcome to the Australian National University. My name is Paul Hutchcroft, Director of the School of International Political and Strategic Studies in the ANU College of Asia and the Pacific. We have today two experts who have come from the Philippines to join our Philippines update that is commencing later today with a focus on Mindanao, but also very much looking at national level political and economic developments. On the political side, we have Professor Ronald Holmes from De La Salle University, and on the economic side, we have Professor Desiree Desierto from the University of the Philippines School of Economics, both from the Manila area, both who have been following these trends for some time. We are gathering at this point 26 months into the administration of President Benigno Aquino III, popularly known as Noy Noy, and at this point he continues to have very high approval ratings, is moving forward towards midterm elections to be held in May of 2013, and coming into office as he did with very strong focus on both anti-corruption as well as anti-poverty efforts. So, welcome to you both. It's great to have you here in Canberra. And my first question is really to have both of you look from the political and the economic standpoint as at what you see as the major achievements of the Aquino administration to date.
Well, when the president started, the first executive order that he issued was an executive order that wanted to create a Philippine Truth Commission. Subsequently, this was declared as unconstitutional, but he did not waver in terms of the pursuit of grand cases of corruption that occurred in the prior administration. Allegations, of course, were made to the extent that the former president and her cohorts did benefit from a number of projects. In that regard, I think the indicators that he has really exhibited pronounced leadership in the anti-corruption campaign will be two impeachments. A resignation on the first impeachment and the conviction of the Chief Justice, the former Chief Justice. And there are two cases against the former president. But these are big fish.
Who is, of course, Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo.
Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo. There are still a number of things that have to be done. For example, he has underscored transparency. And this is evident in the full disclosure policy that they've implemented at the national and local government levels. But what's one thing is that the Freedom of Information Act has not been passed. This morning I read the newspaper, Paul. There's a news story that says that there's no room for the FOI, or the Freedom of Information Bill. And it's literally a room that they can hold a committee meeting on. And I don't know whether it will be passed to support the transparency campaign of the president.
So, just to follow up, as a professor, what grade would you give the president in regard to his two key goals?
I'll give him an average grade. I think it's too early to give a final grade. It's a midterm. It's close to the midterms. And I tend to give a grade that's cumulative. I'd rather not give a high grade right now. I'll say probably on a scale of 0 to 100, I'll give him about 80 at most.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Desiree, looking in the economic sphere, how do you judge the achievements thus far of President Aquino?
So when they started, they really declared that they're pursuing inclusive growth and has identified three key reasons why economic and social progress has been elusive. One is the slow economic growth, another one is inequality, and the third one is corruption.
Right.
And so in order to address those problems, the administration basically aims to generate high sustained growth that can create jobs and reduce poverty, increase investments in key infrastructure, invest in human capital development, and of course improve governance and try to eradicate corruption.
Right.
How has it fared so far? So we're still 2 years into his term, but so far we've had impressive growth rates. I mean, in the first quarter of 2012 we had 6.4%, which was really only second to China in the region. And this now the ADB just recently changed their forecast from 4.8% to 5.5% in 2012, and the World Bank as well changed their forecast to 5%. Now, in terms of job creation, right? So unemployment has gone down a bit, it's at 7%,
Yeah.
but as the ADB reports, a lot of the jobs are really part-time jobs, and underemployment has actually gone up to 22.7%. And there's also a key problem about a third of the labor force is actually in agriculture. But the agricultural sector has contracted. I mean, the growth levels agricultural sector from 4.4% in 2011 first quarter to just 1% growth first quarter 2012. So that's a bit worrying in terms of inequality and eradicating poverty. In terms of the official poverty statistics, it's not out yet. The most recent that we have is 2009, which showed about 26% poverty. But we had a survey on self-rated hunger, I think in August 2012. And although severe hunger went down, reported moderate hunger actually went up. So it's kind of a mixed bag. But in terms of human capital development, I think there have been major strides. The K-12 education system, which imposes universal kindergarten for 12 years after that, has been implemented since 2011, and also the conditional cash transfer program has really expanded. It started with then President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, and by the time her term ended, they had about 700,000 household beneficiaries. Now, currently, we have over 3 million household beneficiaries.
Four times increase.
Yes, so that's quite huge. In terms of corruption, of course, the president enjoys the confidence not just of Filipino people, but also in the international arena. In terms of stats, though, I mean, like Ronnie said, we've had, allegedly anomalous contracts have been canceled. We've had the impeachment of the Supreme Court Justice. In terms of the statistics, the most recent 2012-13 World Economic Forum Global Competitiveness Index, which includes corruption institutions, our rankings improved considerably. The Corruption Perceptions Index, the CPI, we've had an improvement in ranking as well. So the score is now up to 2.6. However, that's not significantly higher than what we've achieved before. Say, for instance, 2006, we had a 2.5 score. In 2001, we even had 2.9. So in a way, it's still too early to tell, but I'm quite optimistic that they're headed for the right path, and I'm hoping that they can really follow through.
So let me ask the same question of you. You're a professor as well. What grade would you give the president at this point?
I think Ronnie and I have the same view, qualitative view, in that it's too early to tell, but things look hopeful and optimistic. But 80% I think is pretty high, isn't it? When I grade my students, I'm a bit stingy. So average would be about 70, 75. But like I said, I'm optimistic.
All right, good. Now, you've each touched on this a bit, but let me ask each of you what you see as the major challenges ahead, particularly as we're thinking out toward the final 3 years of the president's term. Ronnie, first?
I think the most immediate challenge is a challenge that is posed by the midterm elections, slipping into politics. Politics as usual, and this has already been seen insofar as the constitution of the slate of the administration that has been criticized by some quarters as a slate of strange bedfellows.
And this, of course, is his Liberal Party.
It's Liberal
slate.
Party.
At least ostensibly the Liberal Party slate.
There's essentially just one Liberal Party member in the slate. There are three, technically, but the two who came in only became Liberal Party members, I think, the day before the slate was announced. This shows the tendency of administrations really to assemble people who need not necessarily share the same commitment, the same level of commitment towards aspirations. So that's the most immediate one, how to show that really that you're working in alliance with people who are profoundly committed to an agenda, which is to rid government of corruption at all levels and to bring about inclusive growth. The short-term challenge, the medium-term challenge in the next 3 years is really to be able to push for more institutional reforms. I think, Paul, we see the need. No? The practices are okay, the changes in administrative processes are okay, But beyond this administration, would the next government, the next leadership, sustain those practices? You need laws to be able to sustain certain practices. It doesn't assure that the practices will continue. They may defy, they may evade the laws, but at least you have a rule change that will ensure that these processes, an economist called it in Filipino, halongkatan, the ulfabelia. It's essentially turning things around so that you get to find out what's wrong and rectify those mistakes. But even if you've rectified them, you need to institutionalize. And the best way to institutionalize is really to push for statutory changes, which I think is a challenge that the president should get confront head on. And he has not done so.
Thank you. Desiree, in the economics here, you've touched on a bit of this already, but what do you see as the major challenges?
So I think the low productivity of agriculture and industry is something that has to be addressed.
Yep.
Services, we have a boom. I mean, we're really doing really well, but the problem is
Particularly the call centers that have sprouted up all over the country.
Business process outsourcing. But the problem is we still have a third of our labor force employed in agriculture. And I think we really have to look at what are the barriers that have impeded rapid structural transformation as well, the movement from agriculture to industry. So that's one major challenge. Second is, I think there's still a generally low level of competition in Philippine business, in the markets. The administration itself acknowledges this fact, that they basically say in their development plan that in some cases, dominant firms still exert enough social influence and political clout to limit entry, especially in high key sectors like agriculture, maritime and air transport, power, cement, banking. So it's a clear challenge how to break that and how to encourage free entry. Lastly, of course, as Ronnie mentioned, it's this whole issue of how do you ensure that reforms continue even after the administration, right? Because efforts can just fizzle out. This is actually quite hard to do, partially because we have a very weak, if not inexistent, a weak political party system. Basically, we vote for personalities and not parties per se. Like, for instance, we can elect a president and a vice president from different parties.
Tickets, sure.
The problem with that is voters cannot really elect policy agenda. So there's no clear continuity. We don't know what we're voting for. So because of that, I mean, it could easily turn either way. Reforms made in this administration, if they're not institutionalized, can easily just fizzle out.
Let me raise one other issue, and that's environmental challenges. The Philippines, of course, is one of the most natural disaster-prone countries in the world, and that, along with deforestation and degradation of coastal environments and all, has really been a very difficult problem, particularly for people that are already living at the edge. Do you see this administration putting much attention into those issues?
I don't know if it's enough, but the fixes are kind of like temporary fixes. It's about, it's reactive. It's like we pride ourselves in being resilient, being able to cope for, let's say, floods, for instance. But if you think about it, this is very predictable. We face this every year. There has to be some more lasting, infrastructure changes, really, that the government has to look into to have more permanent solutions to these problems. So I think more needs to be done in that respect.
If you had an opportunity to give 3 pieces of advice to the Aquino administration, what would it be for each of you?
Well, political reforms, and political reforms, Paul. Because I guess there has to be some more attention in terms of pushing for reforms. It may be reforms by means of certifying as urgent key legislation. Let's say, for example, as Desiree mentioned, we really don't have political parties to begin with. And languishing in Congress for quite some time have been a number of bills that call for party reforms that will eventually subsidize political parties, ensure that you take away turncoatism, or at least prohibit it, deter it. But that has not been certified. Our central local relations definitely require a revisit. The local government code. There have been
1991.
In 1991, and there have been amendments suggested in that area. But again, insofar as these areas, short of constitutional change, because there's the Liberal Party that the president belongs to batted for constitutional change. It's the first political party that proposed constitutional change in the past. And we do have structural barriers, no? Institutional barriers, I mean, which may require constitutional change, like the system by which we elect our senators nationally is pretty expensive. The proportion of party list representatives.
Just to follow up on that point, 24 senators, 12 elected every 3 years from a nationwide
national constituency, which is really a prescription to spend more on advertising rather than define what the upper house should be and probably elect them to a party list also, or at least regionalize it so that they're closer to larger subnational units rather than the district, which is the lower house. And I don't, that's my advice, really, is just to put more thinking into what are those measures that have to be certified as urgent so that the institutional arrangements can be set in place before the administration goes up. With an administration that enjoys political capital and has enjoyed it for 26 months, it might be missing the opportunity. As the years go along, bills in Congress get to be diluted. And the president's approval or performance rating might even also slide. I think it's high time that, since he enjoys that higher rating, to push for it. Because I'm pretty sure he can mobilize the constituency. And you do have the constituency for these reforms.
So he has the political capital.
He has the political capital. If he enjoys it now, might as well maximize it. To maybe hold a consultative conference, a summit, which former presidents have done, no? On criminality, on poverty, on social sector reform. I think it would be best if he brings together all sectors on a summit in terms of political reforms.
Desiree, what 3 bits of advice might you have for the president?
Okay, one, I think they really have to work for increasing the level of competition in markets. And the way to do this, I think, is not through more regulation and direct enforcement against oligarchic or firms or firms that act monopolistically. I think that would be counterproductive, because basically what would happen is firms can waste resources in trying to avoid and trying to get around regulation, and unfortunately it's the dominant firms that have more resources to do such a thing, so it actually increases the barrier to entry even more for possible competitive businesses. Now, I think a better way to do it is to actually sit down, think of the kinds of structures and regulation that make entry costly, unnecessarily costly, and try to simplify, and so there you have a more level playing field, and it's least costly for firms, for new entrants to come in. That's one. The other thing is the anti-corruption strategy, I think, has to be seen as part of an overall strategy to develop inclusive institutions, if I may borrow the term of Acemoglu and Robinson. The thing with corruption is it's not really a cause, but rather a symptom of having extractive institutions. And the temptation is to focus too much on enforcement, for instance, which could possibly make property rights less secure, for instance, if you start enforcing against canceling contracts, for instance. So that scares investors. So I think if we view it as part of a strategy, overall strategy of building inclusive institutions that basically protect property rights, uphold contracts, promote a safe and stable environment, gives access to opportunities to broad sections of society, I think these kinds of institutions create the right incentives for investment and innovation, which would generate sustained growth. And lastly, which is related to that, I think institutional reform could also be seen as generally as a way of building more trust in society. I mean, the literature, economic political literature, has shown that high trust countries, are more likely to have higher levels of growth and development. And the way to go about that is something to really think about. Is it that having more inclusive institutions actually generate more trust, or is it that more trusting individuals tend to create better institutions? In the literature now, it's a big debate. No one's actually teased it out yet. And the current thing is that there's also a confounding factor. I mean, very recent literature has shown that trust is even influenced by human capital. High human capital individuals tend to be more trusting. I'm actually part of a research agenda which looks at it. I work with some professors from George Mason University and the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, where we found, using data from Moscow and Manila, we actually found that human capital really does raise trust, and the effect is even higher than institutions. So that's something to think about in terms of possible policy interventions, because investments in human capital then does not only raise productivity directly, but it appears that it could also raise trust and social capital, which will be beneficial for the economy in the long run.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to move our discussion away from a specific focus on the Aquino administration to some other issues of great concern in the Philippines today. And a different question for each of you. First of all, Ronnie, of course, the Philippines has just had the historic announcement of the framework agreement between the government and the major Muslim secessionist force in the south, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and it's to be signed in just a few days. What kind of progress do you see foreseeable into the insurgency with the communists in the negotiations, specifically between the government and the Communist Party of the Philippines New People's Army?
Well, there was optimism in 2011 because they resumed the peace talks. I think that was around February 2011. But unlike the discussions between the government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, which went into its 31st exploratory talk and came out with the Bangsamoro Framework Agreement, the discussions with the Communist Party have not proceeded from the first meeting. It has been hindered by questions about the immunity and security guarantees of some members of the Communist Party panel, two of whom I think were arrested in 2011, and that has really prevented them from meeting again. There's also some information that the Communist Party itself, the leadership, has been in some sort of a problem. So there has not been any progress, unfortunately, with regard to the peace talks. And what on the other side, on the part of the government, we have not heard government really reaching out continually, because they've done that in the case of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. In October 2011, there was a conflict somewhere in the south, and the president was being pushed to declare all-out war. And the president said that no, it's all-out justice rather than all-out war. In that particular instance, the president really, again, emphasized that he's after settling the dispute in a peaceful manner. He could also do the same thing with regard to the Communist Party, meet with the leadership, because he met with the leadership of the MILF in Japan, just to assure them that I'm behind this particular peace talks. This is not just something that I'm doing in order to make it appear that peace negotiations should continue, but I'm behind it 110%. He did that for the MILF, and it has reaped dividends through that framework agreement. He should do that also for the Communist Party negotiations.
Do you see that as a possibility from what you know about discussions? I mean, we have an insurgency just as the Muslim secessionist movements have gone on for more than 40 years. A bit longer even, 43 years with the New People's Army. Do you see that kind of push coming from the top?
We have not seen it, Paul, in the last 26 months. Whether it will come about, I think this time I'll be a bit stingy with regard to my assessment. I'll say the probability is maybe lower that it would happen than it occurring, with the president really exercising leadership and making it very clear that he is willing to reach out, offer an olive branch, and have those two panels sit again. because we have not seen it in the last 26 months. We've seen much more seriousness on the part of the president with regard to the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. He met with the leadership very early on and assured the leadership that within the constitutional framework, this can be discussed and we can settle things. You know, when you have the President of the Republic talking to a secessionist group, someone that the government has not offered any sense of belligerent status to, that's really going to boost the other side, the confidence on the part of the other side to sit down and work out an arrangement so that you can end the conflict. I think it's difficult when it comes to an ideological movement, and especially an ideological movement that has been fractured, but has remained resilient despite the fact that the number of armed groups, number of armed combatants has declined, but they're still around, and they can cause disruptions with regard to any of the other plans, including plans for economic growth and attracting investors. You have mining firms in the south, for example, that are worried about the communists because they have conducted raids, aside from the revolutionary taxes. And unless that's settled, it has its economic impact.
Right.
Again, on your question, I think the probability is low that the president will do the same with regard to the Communist Party.
Okay, thank you. Desiree, another question coming forth from the recent framework agreement. Many are talking of the possibility of a peace dividend now, with improved relations possible in the region, and new economic opportunities, particularly that might link the Philippines with neighbors to the south and southwest, Indonesia and Malaysia. What do you make of that talk?
Well, mine is the specific, so we don't really know. It's still going to be, the basic law is still going to be drafted. It's going to be a long process. It still has to be ratified. In principle, some degree of economic autonomy should make it easier to facilitate better ties with neighbors. But however, currently with the ARMM, the Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, we also have already some degree of economic autonomy. Local government units can, say, for instance, raise revenues, can enter into contracts. So I don't see what the big difference would be. The big difference could come from if this is successful, it actually establishes peace, security and stability in the region, that could attract more investment and increase economic activity. The other thing is probably the wealth sharing can incentivize, provide more incentives to try to raise revenues from oil, mineral resources, which is estimated to be about more than $300 billion, which is quite large. But there's a caveat there because such resources can also be susceptible to capture, rent seeking. The question is, with a more autonomous region, would there be less or more rent seeking? I mean, the literature, theoretical literature on this suggests that with more competition among bureaucrats, for instance, that tends to bid rent seeking down. But the thing here is, I don't know if there would be more competition among bureaucrats. Basically, you'd have an autonomous region, and then you'd have less number of bureaucrats among themselves. So it's, in principle, would be easier to kind of collude. I mean, $300 billion is really, it's massive. But the idea is, to what extent can we take advantage of that? It's still an open question. I'm really looking forward to looking at the specifics of the agreement.
Plus, you have the concentration of coercive resources at the local level, too, that can only exacerbate some of those collusion issues.
Yes, exactly.
Ronnie, some speculate that one of the major impetuses for this peace agreement with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front that is just about to be put in place is really a concern about the external sphere of the Philippines, as the Philippines is facing the tensions with China in particular in the South China Sea, now officially renamed, I understand, the West Philippine Sea in Manila. As those tensions have grown, has that been part of the pressure on Manila to resolve some of its insurgency issues?
well, it's hard to say whether they connect the two. I would tend to say that under this administration, there has been much more compartmentalization to the extent that the peace process, the peace negotiations with some groups is in a separate track.
Even in the organization.
Even
of
in
the
the
cabinet,
organization of the cabinet.
sort of that
Although there's a cluster in
compartmentalization.
the cabinet that's called Security and Justice and Peace cluster, if I'm not mistaken. But you know, in the organization of the cabinet right now, the peace talks or peace negotiations is taken care of by the Office of the Presidential Advisor on the peace process. I do not know whether the dispute on the West, with regard to the West Philippine Sea, is something that the administration thinks that we need to settle internal disputes that will solidify our claims on this external, on those particular islands. I think I would tend to say they're linked from each other,
Okay.
rather than seeing that there's something more strategic coming out of this administration. So
So if there's no linkage there, a final question for Desiree is about possible linkages between the Philippines' external opportunities in the economic sphere to the north and these tensions that are going on in China. Do you as an economist see some dark clouds ahead for the Philippine economy resulting from those external tensions?
Well, I think if I'm not mistaken, a couple of months ago, the president clearly declared his preference for a diplomatic approach towards this issue. And I think, I mean, I leave it to the experts to really follow this situation, but I think that has calmed the tension. I think China remains and will remain a major trading and investment partner. So I'm not that worried economically.
All right, good. Well, we'll close it on that optimistic note, and let me just thank you both, first of all, for coming to the Australian National University to join us for the Philippines update that will be starting up later today, and for your insights today on the Aquino administration and some broader issues of Philippine politics and economics. Thanks very much.
thank you, Paul.